In 2019, as I was getting the company off the ground, I made a critical mistake and lost $6,000 over the course of 2 days. So, how did that happen? Let's get into it. Welcome back for another episode of Theory of Why. My name is Rob Johnson. I want to let you know that this episode is brought to you by CGC Water Treatment and Plumbing. More on them later in the episode. So when you first start a company and you're kind of getting your bearings, you're learning the do's and don'ts, professional etiquette, you're learning balance and organization. There's a lot that can go wrong really quickly, especially when the margins are super tight. So to a new business like I was in 2019, $6,000 is a considerable amount of money to lose, especially at that time. I would say our monthly cap was maybe 8 to 10,000, and that's maybe. So our first full year in business in 2019, I was still working at my corporate job. I think I did a hair under 100,000 in sales. So this is a considerable amount of money at any stage in the game, but it's much more pressure and it feels a lot tighter when you are just getting out of the gate. So how did I lose the $6,000? Well, let's go back about 4 months before the this incident took place. We had met with a client who was in Baltimore, Maryland, and he needed some Google ads, some just marketing assistance, getting some stuff set up on social media. And at the time, I had started working with a videographer as a contractor, and he had done a project for me, and it turned out pretty good. There were some things that I wanted to change up, but it was okay. Back in the day before we had the studio, this is probably a very little known fact around here. I had created this service called. We called it, I think, the VP service. It was video and podcasting. And basically how it would work was we would take a mobile kit into the field and we would film a podcast. And then we would have the full-length video. And we would also take a lot of the segments and clips from that and produce, with some B-roll, a finished video. And this was really interesting because in 2019, we didn't have a full video department. We didn't even have a podcast studio open at that time. But I had such a fascination with podcasts and leveraging them in the business world. I created this service to hopefully start chumming the waters and getting people excited about, the use cases for podcasting in business. And we had done a couple of these projects and they turned out okay. There were some things, like I said, I wanted to change. But when this new project came in, and we were talking with the owner, I had mentioned to him, I said, well, what if we came out to Baltimore and we did a video shoot, and I will, I'll pretty much go through everything that we would normally do during a podcast, but we'll also shoot B-roll in the gym. We'll shoot, interviews on location. We'll kind of do a full-scale video production as well. And at the time, my video production experience was little, very little. Didn't know a whole lot about the world at all. And so I decided, well, I've been working with this videographer, so I'm going to go ahead and take him along for this trip. And I think overall it was me and my wife and then another person that worked with me at the time and then the videographer. So 4 of us went out to Baltimore. And I think altogether, I think we spent nearly as much on travel and hotel as we got paid for the video portion of the contract. So really good business decision there. And as the weekend unfolded, it just kept getting progressively worse. So again, me at the time, very little video experience, going and meeting with the client. It was a 2-day shoot. So day 1 went really well, really no problems. It was a good day. Everyone was in good spirits. Day 2 is when it got a little bit dicey. So apparently the videographer I took with me on the road partied a little too hard the night in between shoots, and then he showed up at the shoot the next day, 1, late, 2, hungover, and 3, during the course of the video shoot, promptly fell asleep behind the tripod while he was shooting. And it was It was horrible for a lot of reasons. One, I was outside getting some aerial footage. I was flying the drone around the building as this was going on. So I didn't see this take place until I went in as they were wrapping up like the first session of classes. And it was the perfect storm of everything that you don't want to work, or everything that you don't want to happen rather, during a video production. And I remember I'll never forget this. I was walking out, we finished the shoot, and I took over some of the elements of the filming, and I was very irritated with the videographer, but we were still on site, so not really a frustration I could show at that point. But I remember we were walking out of the door, and I turned to the client and I said, well, how do you think it went? And he looked at me and he's like, well, I guess we'll see how it turns out. And that was the first time I've ever had like a dissatisfied client up till that point. We had been open just probably about a year at that point. And it was like, all right, well, something has gone terribly wrong. And as I started piecing back the rest of the morning and, getting feedback and from the other people that were there as that was going on, I was like, okay, so there was an extreme amount of unprofessional conduct that was going on. And when you're young and learning and trying to, start something different and build on that foundation, there's a lot of natural mistakes that you make. And I think a lot of people are very okay with them staying in the closet. And I am the exact opposite. I want to learn from these mistakes. And moreover, if there's people that are starting media companies and starting to get, some clients in the door, I want you to learn where I've made mistakes as well, because I think that's helpful. That's how we learn. So if you can learn from me and you're like, okay, I need to do a better job of vetting the people that I bring in, and that sounds so commonsensical, right? It's like, oh yeah, you got to make sure that you're bringing the right people with you. Sometimes you don't know who the right people are until you get to know them better, or until you see how they work under pressure or in a different environment. So for me, it was two major learning takeaways from that. Number one was I'm never hiring a contractor again, and I never did. That was the point where I decided to make the company all in-house. And number two, that until we are absolutely ready to roll something out, I'm not going to do it. So until we have a really good process that has been vetted and that we are very comfortable with, I'm just not going to roll that out as a company. It's not the right thing to do. So that's one of the reasons why I am not a fan of contractors working with agencies, is because you can have situations like that have occurred. And not only have I seen it from my perspective, I've heard all of the horror stories from all of our clients, not all of them, but most of them, who have worked with agencies that use contractors. And it's just very inconsistent work. It's work that you wouldn't stand behind as an agency owner, because you're not the one that created it. And for us, it's always made a lot more sense for us to control the entire process rather than having to depend on other contractors. And I've talked about that several times throughout the course of even this show. So in 2019, I had a podcast called Waynecast, and it was basically the origin story of how the company started and active updates on how the company was progressing. So I'd talk about income, clients that we've signed, clients that we've lost. And this was one of the most downloaded episodes of that show, when I talked about, how we lost not only the video contract, but because of the fallout of everything that took place on that weekend, we also lost the marketing contract with that client as well. And up until that point, it was roughly about $6,000 in value. But if you want to look at, the future losses that we had, it's easily over 10 grand over an annual basis. So it's a very good lesson in making sure that you have the right people on your team. And that's something that, as I get older and more experienced in my role now, as we have even more team members, really making sure that we have the right people on the team, because if we don't have the right people on the team, it's not going to work. It's going to stress everyone out. People are going to get pissed off, and then your good employees are going to leave. So that's why I've always tried to pay close attention to our culture, what's working, what's not working, and then also understanding that just because someone isn't where they need to be right now doesn't mean they can't be with a little coaching and guidance. No employee, no associate's going to come out of the gate and be 100% perfect. but there are certain red flags that will alert you to, okay, this isn't working. And when I look at this particular instance, if this videographer had worked with me, that's obviously, one strike. You don't get any more, you're done. That is completely egregious and something that should never happen in the context of a professional video shoot. And when you look at, well, who's responsible for that, it's me. I'm the owner of the company. I'm the one who decided to bring the videographer with us. I'm the one who didn't do a good job vetting who I took with me on the road. So at the end of the day, it was my fault. And that's what I told the client. Like, the videographer's actions aside, it was my orchestration here of how the events played out. And it was the absolute best learning opportunity that could have happened for me, because it gave me so much more confidence in the process, because now I know what not to do. I know what road not to go down. And then as the next year played out, I ended up hiring a full-time videographer in-house over that next year. And we started to build out the video department, which now is, one of our largest divisions of the company, our second largest actually. So it goes to show you that, two things. One, if I would have thrown my hands up and said, okay, well, I guess video is not something our company should be doing. If I would have walked away from that over the last 4 years, I would have walked away from over probably $250,000 in revenue from just video work alone. Moreover, that video work that we shoot influences what we do here in the podcast studio, and it influences the different styles that we shoot in the studio, and how we've done our lighting and setup, and even our sound design. So all of those things that I've learned over the last 4 years in the videography role have translated to the podcast studio. Moreover, a lot of those videos that we've shot, whether in the podcast studio or out in the field commercially, have been utilized for our clients on social media. So that gives our clients another dynamic to play with, because now they don't have to worry about, them taking pictures themselves around the office, or taking their own videos, or having to fuss with all of that and spend all that extra time, because now their agency can do it for them, and it's in-house and done well. So if I would have just walked away, I would have walked away from a lot. And you can't stop something just because it didn't work out right the first time. And that's really important to note, is that you're going to get a roadblock. There's going to be some type of hurdle in your way, and you can either jump over it or you can walk away and not keep moving. But for me, that wasn't an option to just stop, because it was something that was fixable, right? It was something that I saw as being correctable. So when I look at that, it's don't stop just because you have a roadblock. And the second thing is, make sure that you don't push all of the blame off onto other people, and you don't have any learning opportunity there for yourself. I just could never get behind saying, oh my goodness, I can't believe this person did this. It's 100% their fault. I'm going to make sure that, they're punished. Like, I would never say that to a client, because I'm the one that hired them. I'm the one that brought them along, right? And it was just complete ignorance on my part of not having enough details. And if anything, it helped give me a much stronger foundation for the company afterwards, because then I had the mindset of, well, we're not hiring any contractors anymore. Until I can have a full-time position in that arena, we're not going to do the service. And until we have a great process behind it, we're not going to do the service. And it's, from a business perspective, you could argue that having contractors would be cheaper. However, is it cheaper in the long run? Does it guarantee the quality of service for the client in the long run? If we're looking at short-term numbers, we could make a ton of profit short-term, but it wouldn't be long-standing. It wouldn't be anything that I would want to stand behind over a long period of time, because as time goes on, your quality is going to drop because of the lack of consistency, because all those contractors that you hire are not going to stay with you. They don't have to. One of the things that differentiates contractors from employees is contractors get to set their schedule. You can't tell them when to get there and when to leave. They can agree to your proposal, but after time, they don't have to show up 9 to 5 every day. They don't have to take your job over someone else's job if they haven't agreed to it yet. And if someone comes along and offers them more money, there's nothing that's holding them to staying with you. There's no, there's no benefits. There's no company culture they've been acclimated to. There's nothing that's going to keep them at the organization from a contractor perspective other than just more money. And more money isn't always the absolute best thing that you should focus on in your professional career. It's important, but I would argue it's not the most important thing. Like when I worked before this in my corporate job, I could have left and made more money elsewhere, but there was a lot more benefits to staying where I was at other than just what the bottom line of the salary figure was. And there's just been so many different lessons I've learned from that one weekend that has, brought itself into many different iterations of the company. It was absolutely worth it. And thankfully it ended well with the client. He was made whole and he was happy, and we went our separate ways, and there was no animosity there, which was great. And I did my absolute best to make it right because it was unacceptable what took place. And it's interesting. I was reading this morning. It's interesting. I'm talking about this today. This wasn't planned. I wasn't planning on talking about this next part here, but I was reading this morning. There was a wedding photographer locally here, and the wedding photographer had, I guess, a long track record of taking people's money and then not showing up for the day of. And when I say long track record, like this took place over the course of a season, which is a very long time to be able to get away with something like that. And I guess what was happening was she was taking all of the money, spending it, and then not showing up to the job because she didn't have either the proper equipment, or it wasn't really clear what the reasoning was that she wasn't showing up. But the fact is she wasn't showing up. And then someone ended up getting a hold of her, whether it was, I don't know if it was the AP or if it was just someone, one of the upset customers. And her only response was, I've left the, wedding photography business, and, I will do my best to, make sure everyone's paid back. And I'm like, I don't understand that rationale of, well, I'm just going to leave something that I decided to start doing because I had a bad experience and because I screwed people over. Like, you have to work harder to make those things right. You can't just walk away and leave everyone holding the bag, especially for something like that, because what had happened was someone had to get a replacement photographer, and they had to spend more money on that replacement photographer. And I'll tell you this, the last thing you need on your wedding day, if you're the bride or groom, is an additional layer of drama added into the mix. The day is already incredibly chaotic, and your job as a professional in that arena is to make sure that you are taking the most amount of stress and pressure off of the people who are at the center of that day. And it just always strikes me as interesting how people respond to different things, how people respond to failure. And that really tells me a lot about people's character. If you have something bad that takes place and you just cash in your chips and walk away, and to me, that's just not the sign of someone that has a large amount of integrity. And one of the reasons I really enjoyed doing Wayncast that first year of the company is because it gave me a platform and an outlet to actually talk about all the wins and losses of the company, because I could never go to a client, especially when we first started, and say, oh yeah, we've been doing this for years. We're experts. We are seasoned professionals at, social media and web design. Instead it was, no, we are just getting started. Our prices reflect that. Here's why we do what we do, and here's why we love it, and here's why I can tell you you're going to really enjoy the final product. And that was how it was with websites and social media when we started. I didn't have any regrets over how that started or how we pitched the company to people, because I wanted to make sure they knew exactly where we were, exactly how young we were in that marketplace. And then as time went on and we got more experience developing websites and social media, our experience rose, and so did our prices. So now we can sit here and say, yeah, we've done 300 websites. We've shot 250 videos. We've ran social media for companies that have hundreds of thousands of followers and companies that are just getting started. So all of that experience is now built in to who we are as an organization. But I just never felt great about, all right, well, I'm going to go and just act like I'm bigger than I really am. Like, that's just not something I've ever felt comfortable doing. And the reason I wanted to do that first podcast series the year we started was to make sure that I kept myself in check and always talked about not just the wins, but also the losses. And we lost a lot that first year. I remember I worked for an attorney. This is a really quick story, but there was just a lot of politics in the center of that law firm, and different players and fractional marketing officers and people that came into play that really gave us the bad end of that deal, but we were left holding the bag. So that was another lesson I learned, where I'm not going to work for a company where my agency reports to another agency. We just don't do that. I'm not going to report to a fractional marketing officer from some other company. That's just not something I'm comfortable doing. And we just don't do it as a rule for the company anymore. And that came out of that first year where that situation happened. It went really bad. It didn't need to go that bad. But it did. And that's where we made another rule that this is what we're not going to do moving forward. So I'm going to take a break there for a minute, and I want to talk a little bit about CGC. So I have, since I've started this podcast, I've wanted to bring on sponsors that I actually care about and I think have vested in the community that we're in. Our organization is headquartered in Brighton, Michigan. CGC is in Brighton. They also have locations all along the East Coast. But in working with them probably for a year before we even talked about this podcast sponsorship, we've always been at similar events and we've worked together on several projects, and it just made sense to invite them on as a sponsor to the show. So CGC largely is a water treatment and plumbing company. They help residential businesses understand more about how their water systems ought to work, their water quality, and they are just a fantastic group of people that really do look to consult rather than sell, which is something that resonates with me, as that's a practice we have here at our company. So if you want to know more about CGC, you can take a look at the website on the screen. You can also check out the show notes, contact them, and learn more about what they do and how they can help restore your water to where it ought to be. All right, so as I wrap up this podcast, there's a couple things that stand out to me, and that's, you have to be extremely self-aware about where you're at in the business process. If you're a brand new business owner and you're getting started, if you're a solopreneur, don't use the word our. So at our company, here's what we do. It's just you, and it's okay that it's just you. It's okay that it's just one person. It's completely fine. No one cares that you're just getting started and then it's only you. You don't need to appear bigger than you are, because then what happens is you get put in a very uncomfortable position when you're pitching a client and they say, oh, so tell me about your company. How big are you? Oh, well, it's just me. Oh, well, all over your website, you say we and our, and you make it seem like you have a big company, and that just puts you in a very awkward position. So just be honest about where you are in the moment. I'll give you another quick story. So when the very first 6 months we opened the company, I put out a post on Instagram and it got reshared, and someone from California that owns a pretty large video production company saw the post, and she called me and she said, hey, we are looking for a social media company that can help us just take content from our video team and put it out online. And she's like, we're getting ready to open a location in Nashville. And she's like, it's a very big operation, but she said, I liked your post. So would you be willing to, take this on and, give us a price for that? And I said, absolutely. We can totally do that. And she's like, well, how many people are in your company? I think at the time we had 4. So I said, well, it's 3 people and then myself. And she's like, okay, well, how many clients do you have? And I can't remember the exact number of clients, but I think it was right around 15 that we had. And she's quiet for a minute, and she's like, if that's the case, she's like, that means each one of your people have roughly, 3 to 4 clients a piece. And I was like, yeah, that's probably accurate. And she's like, I'm really looking for a company that can just treat us as if we're, their only client. And I said, well, if that's the case, I said, you're probably not going to want to work with an agency, because agencies don't have, one employee. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio. And the benefit of an agency is it's obviously cheaper. And I said, it's probably better for you guys to hire in-house, but that might be, more expensive. And she's like, all right. She's like, well, she's like, you give me a lot to think about. And she's like, we probably are going to, pursue other options. And then, that was the last time I heard from her. The point of that story is, if I would have told her, oh yeah, we have, there's a ton of people, we have a ton of bandwidth, we can absolutely accommodate you. And then I'm going to bend over backwards and make all of these promises. Very quickly on in the agreement, as the relationship develops, she's going to know that that's not who we are as a company. We're going to get caught. So to me, it was just always best practice to be self-aware. And then the second piece of advice I'd give you, and something that I've learned, is being realistic about expectations. So in 2020, I've talked about on this show kind of this routine tradition that I have on every New Year's Eve. I kind of write out the business plan and goals for the next year. And it's been something I've done since I've started the company. And in 2020, I had a very unrealistic expectation. I was going to double company revenue into the next year at like the 6-month mark, and then I wanted to double our headcount. And it didn't happen. And when it didn't happen, I was very disappointed about it because I felt like I had failed. But we grew by probably 40%, which was great. But I wasn't being realistic about the expectations for the company, because the first couple of years, from year 1 to year 2, we tripled in revenue. From year 2 to year 3, we doubled. So I just thought that multiplier was going to keep happening. But the bigger you get, the harder it is to have a true double, right? And I was just not being realistic about the expectations that I was putting on myself to make that happen. So if you can be extremely self-aware about where you're at in the business, and then you can be realistic about where you're going, that's a really good, healthy formula to make sure that you don't get discouraged when things don't turn out exactly the way that you think they ought to, and to make sure that you stay grounded and you don't try to appear or come off bigger than you actually are. So those are two very critical things that I would consider as you walk away from this episode. And I certainly appreciate you guys listening to the story. And if you've had a similar instance where you've made a pretty big blunder for your company, I'd love to hear it in the comments. So if you're watching on YouTube, feel free to drop the story on there, or you can also email it to start@waynemedia.com. So thanks so much for listening, everyone. We'll catch you next week. Take care.